you for coming to my talk. Today's talk is going to be about the state of React state management. How many of you actually use React right now? Learning or, okay, that's what I expected. Obviously, you're here at this talk. Makes sense. My name is Riaz Virani. I'm co-founder of a company called Hybrid Hero. It's kind of funny you can just call yourself that by like starting a company a week ago, which is literally what I did. But anyways, we're not launched yet. If you want to go look it up, you can look it up online. We build tools for a hybrid work team, so if you're interested, obviously you can look that up later. And you can learn more about me, things I've written, things I've said, other talks I've given at riazv.me. So again, if you're filtering in, try to generally grab a seat on this side because I'm going to ask you guys to raise hands a couple times during this presentation. What I mean by that is this presentation is interactive. Who's ever seen me? I know a couple people have seen the audience before, have seen me give a talk before. Okay. So usually I try to play it on the bleeding edge. I do a lot of live coding. I like to add some danger. This is not that kind of talk. The worst thing that's going to happen to this kind of talk is going to ask you to raise some hands because I want to get a sense of experiences you guys have had. We're going to be talking about options today for building a real web application, right? So it's not just about my opinion. It's actually kind of interesting to see everyone else's opinion. Also, unlike my normal talks, I will not be showing any code. I don't normally never show code. I'm just like, oh, let's do it live, and then oh my god, it worked. Everything you're not supposed to do. But during this presentation, it'd just be too complicated to show you a variation of the 20,000 ways to do Redux and the 20,000 ways to do MobX. It's just not really feasible when we're talking about React state. I'm also not going to push a particular library on you. I don't have an answer as to what you should specifically use in your project, right? Because a lot of times you come to this talk and it's like, oh, we're debating as a team as to what we should do for adding a state management library to our application. However, I have opinions, as any good developer does, and I'm going to label them as such, right? You're not a bad person if you disagree with me, so I will kind of present what I think is the most objective information and then kind of give you my opinion, and that's when we'll get into a little bit of the raising hands. I want to hear about how many people have tried X library or tried X approach. How many of you like it? How many of you are moving off of that approach or moving on to it? So anyways, let's get started, right? Let's start it with the official React state management module. Yeah, well, there isn't one. I love asking that question just to look through the audience because things move so fast in React. Half of you are like, oh my god, did they launch something? Did this just happen today? I don't know about it. And to me, React state component or React component state is not a state management solution. You can invent one out of it, right? You can kind of put it together in a way. And how many of you right now in your apps are not using any state management library, are just using use state or legacy use, okay, set state or whatever. Cool. How many of you like it? Those of you said yes. How many of you are on it? How many of you are trying to move to something at this point or deciding? Okay, a couple hands. Cool. So why is that? Well, the answer is it's just how we do things in React, right? We don't like standardization of any sort. And by the way, 5 more libraries have launched since we just started this talk, right? That's how this ecosystem works. And some of the root cause of why, we'll explore that in a bit, but it's resulted in essentially what is fragmentation, right? And this is something that any of you that have been doing this for a while can kind of tell, it's a bit of a fragmented sort of ecosystem where you're cobbling together libraries to sort of build your own front-end framework. And so it's always been fragmented, especially when you compare it to its competitors. And I wanted to point this out that this is, if you're only in React land, this is not the way everyone else works, right? It's a bit unique to us. If you've ever used Ember, how many of you have ever even tried using Ember? That's about the number of hands I expected, yeah. I like Ember. It's relied upon. Some very large companies use them as a pretty critical part of their stack. And they've built in data management as a core piece from day one, but it's not as popular. Angular, how many of you have Angular 1 or 2 apps? Okay, how many of those, just raise your hands, are just maintaining legacy Angular 1 or 2 apps that the company launched years ago? Yeah. But they have a concept built in called NGRX that's designed to be their approach to how to manage your application state. And then Vue, which has come more recently, who's ever used Vue and Vuex? Okay, wow, this is really helpful. I'm actually learning a lot by seeing the number of hands go up. So they build in Vuex, which is sort of a version of Redux inside of Vue, and it's built into the actual framework. It's not a thing you cobble on. It's like a first-class citizen that they maintain. But again, we get back to why is React different? Why did we not choose to kind of follow the same path? Well, how many of you have ever heard this thing? React is Vue only. React is the Vue only part of the framework, right? And React in comparison was never meant to really manage complex state. It was designed to only manage the view layer. This is sort of a critical part of how it was created. And if you look back, this is a blog post. This is like one of the first blog posts in the official React blog. And if you look back in 2013, this is the year React launched. And their justification was, we are explicitly not an MVC framework, right? Like, it wasn't even just a random thing that they don't manage the sort of state and the model layer. It was actually a core part of why they designed the framework to be the way that it was. So it was in some ways a response to some other frameworks, because back then, remember, we had like Backbone.js. Raise your hands, how many of you ever had to use Backbone.js or even know what that is? Oh yeah, those are the OGs, all right. So another reasoning for this, right, is like, if you look at Facebook internally, they had a thing that was sort of a Flux, which is a pattern, and they had a thing that the logo on the top right is the logo for Relay. And Relay was their mechanism in-house for doing exactly what Redux and MobX and all those other things do today. And if you look at this diagram, this is their official diagram of what the Flux architecture is. And it's really complicated, especially as they implemented it in Relay, because that part there that says dispatcher, like, you had multiple dispatchers aggregating data requests from multiple parts of your application. Anyways, I'm not even going to go into the detail. It was really hella complicated, and no one really uses it nowadays. I think even they've kind of said, if you look at their README, you should probably use something else. I kid you not. If you go to their page, it's like, you shouldn't really use this anymore. But Facebook had a thing, and they were like, we don't care. You guys do whatever you want, right? We have what we need for our application. Anyways, I was thinking through this today, and it sort of reminded me of this saying. Let 100 flowers bloom, let hundreds of schools of thought contend. Now, just say it out loud. Who actually knows who said this? Oh my goodness, you guys are terrible at history. Someone's got to know. No one ever paid attention to history class? Okay, well, someone said something? No? Oh my God, still terrible at history. This was Mao Zedong. Right? And I'm not trying to make a political statement, but the concept was, he was like, well, let all these ideas bloom, and the best ones will just filter to the top. It's sort of the core concept, right? And that, by just happenstance of history, is where we've gotten. So for the rest of our time, we're not going to talk about theory and history. We're going to actually look at tactically what's available to us today, but we're going to look at it through the context of history. We're going to go through what solutions have emerged over time. And this is kind of the rough history that we're going to follow. It seems a long time ago, right? But React launched in 2013, right? This was that time where we were dealing with Backbone and where Flux was sort of even a new word to people. In 2014, we had a bit of a reaction to that, and Redux launched by a really nice gentleman named Dan Abramoff. Those of you know that name, he's made a bunch of libraries, and he launched Redux that became fairly popular, still popular today. 2015, we had a reaction to that, and then we had MobX. And then in 2018, you had the official React team add context. And we're going to go through each of these in detail in sort of the slides that are following this. 2019, hooks launch, right? Kind of changes the game of how we all write React. And then the timeline gets a bit blurrier there. Like, in the last couple of years, atomic state management libraries have become a viable alternative to sort of the traditional large state libraries like Redux or MobX. And you have the query cache libraries. I know that's a really official term, but it's sort of like the Apollo clients and things that sort of handle making your query, like your data, and storing it for you as well. That's a viable option. And then in 2021, I don't know if this is going to become a real thing. How many of you have heard of use-selected context? Didn't even know that's a thing. Okay. So one of you. Okay, so this is a proposal. This is an RFC that came out in 2019, but is being worked on in 2021 to fix the problems in React context for people that want to use it for more than just like, whether you're using light or dark theme, that kind of thing. And we'll talk about why React context has a flaw that prevents you from using it as your general application state. But this is a proposal to actually fix that. Okay, so people in React are very opinionated. There's a lot of libraries. We will be ignoring some options, right? I kind of gave you the general guideline of what we're going to follow. We're not going to be talking about the library you invented at 2 a.m. that has like 50 stars that you're like, screw everyone else, I can do this much better. And the reason for that is, if you actually look at all the libraries that are available, it is insane. Like, just scrolling through them, right? If you're going from like other worlds, you're like, why is there so many options? It's like, there's a lot of options. We can't cover all of them. They're mostly not worth covering. A lot of them are defunct. So we're going to ignore some. But let's jump back. We talked about Flux and Relay, right? That's sort of the OG, the original idea of how to do our data management that was proposed by Facebook, Flux being a pattern, and Relay being their implementation of it. Well, so we kind of were all looking at it, and everyone basically went, this is hella complicated. Everyone who tried it. One last kind of set of hands. How many of you ever tried at that time in 2013 to implement Relay? That's what I expected. One. Okay, that's what I expected. It was so complicated to do in a real production context. So we invented Redux. All right, so what is Redux, right? I'm not going to show you code because there's a lot of ways to do this. But Redux is a library that adopted the Elm architecture. How many of you know what Elm is? Okay, so Elm is sort of a boutique, very specialized, although people that love it really love it. It's an alternative programming language that compiles to JavaScript and has the same pattern as Redux of your actions, state, and view to build your state. In general, the concept is that it forces you to take all your state into a centralized store. So imagine a big JavaScript object in the sky that can have a lot of data. And you can only change that with immutable functions, or that immutable state with known functions called actions that just make no side effects except for just changing that state. So fancy terms, it's basically a big object in the sky and you've got known functions that can change that state, and then your React application changes its view by listening in on how that state is currently represented. But it means you get a snapshot generally of your whole application at one time. And again, it's forcing you to write named types of changes to your application. So you can't just willy-nilly change your state. You have to say, here's how I'm changing my state, right? That's its gift and its curse in some ways. So what are the general pros and cons, right? It's still popular, right? So you will get a lot of people that know it. Everyone has an opinion on it if you've used it before. It's pretty battle tested, it's pretty stable, has a lot of sound computer science principles behind it. It has the specialized Redux DevTools Chrome extension that is a joy to work with. Once you've got Redux working, using the DevTools are great because you can inspect your application state very easily. And it allows for a thing called time travel debugging, because remember, if all of your state's in this like giant object in the sky that changes in the snapshot and snapshot, you can just reverse the snapshots and you can essentially go back in time in your application. There's lots of libraries that work with it. There's Redux Persist, there used to be Redux Form, there's like Redux whatever, right, that you can use, and everyone's added either logging middleware or something. So it's sort of this common thing, almost kind of like Express, right, might be for the back end, even though they do different things. But cons, very heavy on boilerplate. This is something everyone's dealt with, right? It's like I write so much freaking code just to make this one simple thing work in my application. There's really no agreed upon patterns for how to structure your state, right? You sort of invent your patterns for a world that big object in the sky looks like. It doesn't treat UI state of like, whether you've expanded a toggle or a dropdown any differently than server state. You have to kind of figure out how to structure that yourself. And the global nature of it, because it's one big object in the sky with everything, can lead to performance issues. Because if you're, say, tracking a form, this is a problem with Redux Form, every keystroke was causing a re-render constantly, and all of these actions and reducers, that whole Redux machinery had to rerun. And then you have to make a whole bunch of workarounds to make it not rerun, right? So you have to sort of do a lot of complexity. One I didn't mention on there is there's no asynchronous part of it by default, so you have to usually use something like Redux Thunk, again, additional libraries and complexity and boilerplate to get it to work. Raise your hand if this sounds familiar to you, like those of you who ever tried Redux. Okay. So this is the one that's funny where sometimes you get like a couple hands, you get half the hands, and then it's like you say something and it's like all the hands go up at the same time. It's funny. So here's my opinion. It was great at the time as the best of the Flux-inspired state management libraries. However, it's not necessarily the best developer experience. Oh! Did I like knock it off? Okay. It was great at the time as the best of the Flux-inspired state management libraries. However, it's not necessarily the best developer experience today. Hooks have dramatically reduced its reliance upon boilerplate, so that's an improvement. But I would say for the most part, unless you have a team that knows it, really likes it, has patterns, maybe you can use something like a Redux Toolkit, again, another library to simplify developing it, and you already have prior experience. Use it if you like it. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But if you're starting from scratch, generally I would say there's better options available today. So in a smaller audience, I would just ask for people's opinions, but right now it's like, who generally agrees with that perspective? My opinion on there. Okay. Who disagrees with it? Oh, that's amazing. No one. Wow, okay. This is fascinating. All right, so let's move on. So we were all looking around and we were like, Redux has too much boilerplate, so let's invent MobX. I don't think that's exactly what the maintainers were thinking. I think they were somewhat also inspired by the changes occurring in Angular, and that's they share some similarities in how they think. So MobX, you can kind of see on the right the diagram, it's got some similar elements, but in a very different way. And it's hard to describe it in just a few sentences, but it's built upon the concept of functional reactive programming. I know it's a lot of large words put together, but that sort of like reactive programming model it has some subtle differences that are really important. And if it's interesting to you, I would encourage you to go dig into it. It usually involves multiple stores in a single application, whereas Redux only has a single store. So it solved the problem as one giant store that everything has to talk to, can cause performance issues, et cetera. And it's, again, much more familiar to people coming from a functional approach to programming. And a lot of people in React at the time were realizing that, especially in React, functional programming made a lot of sense. It had a lot of benefits, especially in sort of the way you have to think about how your application state lives. And it's still moderately popular. It's still not as popular as Redux, but like it's been around for a long time and people are still using it. There's still large applications, there's add-ons, it's not gonna die away. So you don't have to worry about it being an unsupported library anytime soon. And as a primitive, you can just sort of see that the really big difference there is the reactions part on the right. It's different than sort of binding to Redux state. So pros and cons, again, moderately popular, it's still battle tested, it's been around for a long time. For things that come and go in the React world, like all those libraries we saw, MobX is stuck around, it's kind of stood the test of time. It's much less in terms of boilerplate, and again, long-lived, smaller developer community. It does rely upon the concept of like impure functions versus Redux has pure functions. So again, your functions are kind of really tied to the notion of the MobX sort of state that it's representing. Makes it harder to test. But I don't know how many people actually test their front ends anyways nowadays. I think like it's sort of a dream we all have, but it's always harder to do in practice. And there's really not agreed upon patterns for how to put things in your MobX pieces of state, right? You still have to decide that. It still doesn't give you a clear story of like all the different kinds of state you have. How should you think about it? And again, if you have to coordinate, communicate across stores, again, I haven't used MobX, but I've heard from people it can get kind of challenging if you didn't put things in the right store and you have to talk across them, because then you've got to subscribe and unsubscribe across them. So opinion time, I don't like it, but this is purely personal opinion, right? Like I've seen others that do really enjoy using it. I've seen production applications that have a good time with it. I personally don't see the benefit over using an atomic state management library, which we're going to discuss later. So this is I think I'll have a smaller number of hands. Who's used MobX before in an application? Okay, smaller number of hands. And like generally for you guys, do you guys enjoy it? Has it actually been a positive experience? No, mediocre? Okay, interesting. I was talking to a friend who was kind of saying like, oh, I'm going to talk about this, and he's a React developer for a lot of years, and he's like, yeah, we use MobX and we love it. And I'm like, oh, it's the first time I've heard that. But like, so far the answer is no one likes anything in React, right, in terms of state management. So it's not that bad to be like, yeah, it's okay. So we were all sitting there going like, hey, MobX is still not a part of React core, so let's invent React context. And I'm not saying my puns at the top, but I'm very proud of them. I work really hard at my puns. My wife is in the audience here, and she's like, she hates my puns, but I love my puns. So React context was the first option outside of component state, really built into React itself to be able to hold data, right? And they intended it to have a very narrow focus, right? It allows you to share data without passing it via props. But they wanted it to be a small amount of data, right? So the intention was to store global data that doesn't change very often, like whether you're using a light or dark theme, or what's the user ID. And they did, by the way, add a hook variant, right? So there is use context now in 16.18, even though hooks themselves launched in 16.3, which was pre-hooks. So this is a very short list of pros and cons, because again, the pros are just, it's built into React. You don't need to add to your bundle size, learn an API that's really complicated. It's very simple to use, but it's not designed to hold your application state, right? And I think what kind of happened is we were all looking for something that the React team would give us. We were like, oh, here's a thing you could put data in, and we all were like, let's put stuff in there and like get rid of all these other libraries. And if you read their docs, you're like, that's not what we meant it to be for. And we were all like, why did you put this? Why did you invent this then? But the biggest con is that whenever you so essentially you have a context that wraps all your components that want to use some shared piece of data, if you change any piece of that context, they all re-render. So imagine if you put all your application states, like anytime you make a change to your context, every component in your application has to re-render. So that created a really large performance issue for a lot of applications that try to put more into it than they intended. So as a result, when I said your component state is not a state management system, React context is also not a state management system, right? You can kind of jigger it together with a little bit of context, a little bit of use state or whatever, and kind of invent one yourselves, but we're looking to not invent something ourselves, right? We're looking to get a standard solution for a standard problem, storing our API call data, storing other sort of common pieces of application state. So here's my opinion. It has one absolutely fatal flaw. If any part of your context changes, all the components using that context also re-render, even if they don't use that part of the context. That means it's not practical for any significantly large applications to general state store. So maybe some of you when this launched were like, I know what this is for and used it correctly. How many of you are like, oh my God, this is amazing. We have a final solution. We can just put all of our stuff into it, and we're disappointed like me? Hands? A couple hands? Yeah. I would agree with you, and I think the challenge to me was like, the problems I had was like, if I could do it that way, I would just use regular use state or like set state anyways. So again, there's a bunch of, it's not that it's completely unuseful, but if you want to create an overarching system that can hold a lot of data and not worry about where it's tied to and performance implications it can have, it doesn't really suffice for that. But it's not like you can't use it, like it will work, and that's why I included it here. It's a pretty big part of React, right? And it's more heavily used by, let's say, theming libraries or third-party libraries to kind of share data whenever you have like your Stripe provider, whatever. Usually behind the scenes, those are going to use something like context. So this is when we're all just like, React team, just tell me what to do. And so in 2019, we get the hooks API. Now, I agree, this is a little bit different. It's not really a state management solution, but it's such an important part of React, we have to talk about it. You got me hooked, I like that one. Okay. So hooks changed everything, right? About how we write React starting in 1618, right? It's not just about state management. Set state replaced use state. Sorry, that's the other way around. Never mind. Use reducer and use context were also added. Ease of using React dramatically decreased. Increase. I think I wrote everything in the opposite on this slide. Yeah, it should be increased and increased. That was to make sure you're listening. So, the pros in general, we have these other primitives. They don't really fundamentally change the kinds of things we can do, but there's no separate library needed. There's very little boilerplate or learning curve to get started, although there's a lot of complexity behind the scenes that it has a really good abstraction around. It's fairly easy to understand, and most other React state management libraries converted their interfaces to be hook-based, including MobX, Redux, etc. And again, cons are it's still not a new kind of primitive that lets us hold everything together. Now the exception to that is you can use reducer with use context to hold everything in there, and use reducer kind of imitates the Redux pattern as a hook. However, you still have the limitations of context. And so my opinion on this is that like, if you think this is a big momentous thing, which it was, but the answer is it really was more about how it enabled other people to change how they wrote their libraries, right? So while not more powerful than just component state on its own, hooks had a dramatic impact on React as third-party state management libraries could simplify their interfaces. This is most significantly felt in Redux, as hooks reduced Redux's hefty boilerplate code. This is kind of across all the libraries, but it was more about how everyone else was able to use hooks as an interface to their state management library than it really was that hooks on their own could be used in a specific way. Although I would say that, yeah, like in general, the use state hook pattern is a little bit more elegant and nicer and less visually easier to absorb than the sort of set state stuff that we did with class components. So I kind of think like everyone went like, I can do so much with hooks, let's invent more libraries. And so in 2019, when we got hooks, I mean, there's so many hook-based libraries that erupted, not just the existing ones, but new ones as well. And so part of this mix, some of these libraries started in 2018, 2019, but they're continuing to develop now. I call them the atomic state management libraries. It's sort of a classification of a library type. Atomic explosion in libraries. So atomic state management libraries are not a single library, but a pattern of thinking. Atomic state is where global state is encompassed in small atoms, quote unquote atoms, right? Rather than large common stores of lots of values. Popular atomic state management libraries include Recoil, Valtio, Zustand, and Jotai. So how many of you are looking at or using one of these libraries right now that are sort of more atomic based? Oh, interesting, only 5 or 6 of you. Okay, cool. So Recoil is probably the most popular one because it's the one that Facebook's actually building themselves. So the pros are, it's usually really easy to pick up and learn. It's very small amount of syntax. They don't suffer as heavily from performance issues as global state management libraries because each atom is quite small. Literally think, when I'm saying atomic state management libraries, think of Redux if you're familiar with that, right? Remove the boilerplate and imagine that each value, each key and value was like its own little thing. Like you're not thinking of them as a group, you're thinking of them as individual little elements. So you have lots of options to try out, including the Facebook-backed Recoil.js. Although it is not 1.0, and the official GitHub org they've marketed under is called Facebook Experimental. So that gives me a little bit of a pause. But it actually has been pretty stable, and they've been working on it a lot. Yeah, very lightweight and boilerplate. So again, the cons are they're just a bit newer. They're not as battle tested. They're still sort of a see who the winner is going to be. And there's really not any clear community patterns for where to break up your atoms and how many atoms to have. And all those libraries I mentioned earlier, they all have few trade-offs. What's ironic is 2 or 3 of them are actually backed by like pretty much the same maintainer who's been writing them. He's a very prolific maintainer. I think his GitHub is called Daishi, and he's written a ton of React libraries that are really well maintained. But so opinion time, this is like my favorite pattern for React state management. In particular, the Valtio library. Essentially, it works as a component state at a global level without any additional ceremony. I would definitely give these libraries a shot if you are not familiar with them. So there's not a clear answer to these, and some of them look a bit more like Redux, some of them don't. The 4 I mentioned are generally, like I would say they're stable enough to, and they're going to live long enough to be used in the long run. One of the pro I didn't mention is that it's very easy. Almost all these atomic libraries are built with suspense in mind, and suspense is going to be supported when it finally becomes stable as a first-class citizen. So you kind of get that versus I'm not sure how easy it's going to be to adopt some of the older ones for suspense. So then we were all like, hey, my state is just data I query from my server. And so let's invent query cache libraries. Again, these have been around for a couple of years now, not just 2019, 2020, 21. But again, I don't know if they call them that. I call them query cache libraries. So query cache libraries are not a distinct thing again, but they're just a pattern. Most applications use state management libraries to store data queried from a server. So why not merge your store with your data query library? These libraries argue server cache state is not the same as other state. So what I mean by that is Apollo Client is probably the most famous one of these, right? If you use GraphQL and you use Apollo Client, they have this concept where, hey, when you ask us to hit your server, we have just a configuration option where we'll store the data that you got back for that query. And then when you want to use it again, you can just ask us to use our own cache. And so like, you don't need to have this whole separate thing to track loading state, error state, kind of in line with what we saw Kent show, right? That's a souped up version of even that, where that whole piece of getting data from your backend is just abstracted away. Well, that thing now is also able to store your data. The 3 main libraries I've seen are React Query, Apollo Client, and SWR is made by the people making Vercel. So they're generally pretty well supported. They've been around for a while. They're stable. And if that's the approach you have, again, if your application is that basically I make a query to my backend and I display it and I'm just doing that over and over and over again, this is potentially a good option for you. So again, it solves a lot of related problems in a React application when dealing with query data. So the other thing I didn't talk about is like most of these libraries also include, oh, you can just give me a configuration to repull this data or to requery the data when someone goes to a different browser tab and back, right? It's not just about storing state. They can solve kind of the broader problem for you of all the other things that go along having to hit your API and store your data. They often improve performance by smartly deduping API calls. So you have 2 different parts of a page trying to make the same call. Sometimes if they make it in the same way, they'll just not even hit it twice. They'll just hit it once and share that data, and you don't even realize they've made that optimization for you. And again, the popular libraries, the 3 I mentioned, have really strong backers by large organizations that are sort of known in the JavaScript community, and they're pretty adept in making supportable libraries. Kind of argue Apollo Client has made some shady decisions in the past, if you know what I mean, but the rest of them have done a pretty good job and they're always getting better. The biggest con, right? I said all these things they can do for you, you can solve all these problems. Well, the biggest con is whenever you entrust another library to do some magic for you and solve the problem for you, when it doesn't work, it's really hard to debug when it acts in an unexpected way. Because like they're doing this caching and deduping and all this stuff, and you're like, wait, something happened I didn't expect, and now you're like, well, what did the library decide to do, right? You don't know because you're not able to easily inspect that code. So there's a trade-off there. Anytime you entrust, you get some magic, you also get some mystery. So, oh, I like that. I should use that in the future. So, and yeah, usually they don't supporting other kinds of data. If you have other application state that's not just an API call, Apollo client does have an option to store data within it, but there's sort of iffy support for, whether you still need another solution to store all the other data. It's not just a query from your server. So opinion time, as you can already tell, I have mixed feelings about these libraries. I've had poor experiences with Apollo client. It appears to work until it doesn't, and then you're debugging library internals or behavior at the very least. If you are going this route, I recommend React Query or SWR as better alternatives. That's, again, personal opinion, if you really want to try these out. How many of you are interested or have tried one of these libraries, or tried one of these patterns out? Okay, actually more than I thought. That's awesome. Cool. So, Facebook. Just solved this already. So let's invent use selected context. So I have no puns for this one, but it's really hard to make a pun out of use selected context. So this is a proposal that came up in 2019 to fix context's major flaw. Again, only when you're using it as sort of a general application state store. It kind of fixes the problem of unneeded re-renders for components that don't use that part of the context. It's very, very bleeding edge. It's so bleeding edge, it's not even in React. It's under, I think, like a flag, under like a use experimental kind of flag. And there is a similar implementation in a library called use context selector by a fairly prolific maintainer. It's actually made by the same guy who's at the Daixi GitHub. And it's actually under the hood. That library is used by a bunch of other big libraries too, where they kind of use context, but it gives you that behavior of not re-rendering if you're binding to only a specific part of the state. What is that? Oh, there we go. I thought I saw something else on the screen. It's like I thought maybe it showed something else. Okay, so where does this leave all of us, right? Like we've kind of gone through a bunch of options, and like we started with this place of Mao Zedong, right? We started with like let 100 flowers bloom. It leaves us in the exact same place. So we started at one place and we ended up pretty much at the same place. We still have sort of a plethora of options. There's not really a standard way that someone could say, this is the best way that, like if you're using Ember and you don't use Ember data, you're probably doing something wrong, right? But if you're in React and you're choosing to use any one of these options, it's debatable, right? It's debatable for your circumstance and what you like and what you prefer. So I kind of want to modify that saying. Here's the general theme, right? I think what's kind of happening is every time, every new library, every new generation, every new solution is just an overreaction to the last library. Is how I feel like we generally operate. It's sort of our operating ethos in the React ecosystem. Good and bad, but it keeps us moving, right? It gives me more things to read on my GitHub announcements. But I will say one thing that is maybe some more practical, right? You can't fit a square peg into a round hole. Use the tool that was designed for the job you're trying to accomplish. It's the most generic saying, but in the end of the day, try an option and don't force yourself because you saw someone else say use this solution. Try it out, and it's like you'll usually know within a day or two it feels right or not, right? And so with all of the curse of the various options, we get choices. And so as developers, let's use those choices. Trust your instincts, try it out. If it feels good, keep going with it. If it doesn't feel good, ditch it. Doesn't matter what anyone else tells you to do. Versus, again, if you're in Ember or Angular, it's like you got to do the thing they told you to do, right? So this is my final slide. It's my favorite GIF. All right, so that's my presentation. Hopefully you learned something that you didn't already know. I know I did. I learned that for some reason on certain slides, I decided to write everything in the opposite direction. Cool. All right. So before I take questions, the best way to contact me is my contact information is on riazv.me. There's email, phone, all that stuff. I do occasionally tweet. If you want to tweet at me, I'd just DM me. And that's my self-portrait. It must be really pretty. Anyways, any questions? Yeah.
I had a question about kind of local state management libraries. Like, do you have much experience with like XState or things that are kind of more locally scoped with Redux, but they're still kind of a state?
Yeah, I've never used XState personally. I've kind of like read through the documentation. It felt kind of in essence similar to a little bit of the atomic state management libraries, but they have the sort of notion of like a state machine and transitions that go through them. So I do see they're sort of a hybrid between like kind of Redux and something else. I don't think they're a bad idea. I just get really weirded out by like how XState's like a general library, then you have XState React. And addition to that, I did kind of see they've stopped maintaining as heavily the React part of it. That may just be because it's done and they don't need to, very possibly. But I don't have strong opinions on it as I haven't had a lot of first-hand experience. Maybe someone else has, and if you do, raise your hand, I'd love to hear it. Yeah. Oh, great, yeah. So that's the solution we've all been looking for, right? Just use that and you're good to go. Yeah.
Can you share what you use in your current or most recent project, like for different kinds of state problems?
Yeah, I think most recently I've kind of jumped on the Valtio train for the last couple projects. So Valtio is one of the atomic libraries, and it literally kind of looks like useState, but just at a global level. And the other thing I like about it is that your little atoms can still update their Redux DevTools. So you can actually still inspect your state that way. And the other thing is that you can utilize subscribe as well as update your state even outside of React. So like you can have an on-click handler that just calls a plain function. It does not have any of the use effect or use callback, whatever, and that thing can just import your atom and just make changes, and everything that's bound to that will still react. I've become increasingly a really big fan of that. I know hooks are awesome, but inevitably what happens is like you get a lot of these re-render triggers with like callbacks and effects and all that stuff, and trying to guess how you've kind of set your prerequisites for those changes correctly. And so whenever I can, I jump out of React entirely for like a click handler into plain async functions that just do a sequence of things without worrying about causing an inadvertent re-render. So that's sort of my current pattern. But now that I think of it, I think the only one I haven't really used up there is probably MobX as well as XState, and I'm actually curious to try XState more heavily, since this is not the first time I've heard someone mention that.
What do you do for network requests?
So I just use GraphQL request, I think, like the primitive version of it. So I do use GraphQL for all my backend APIs. And again, I found with Apollo Client, you've got all the extra sort of, I can do caching for you, I can do all this or all that, and I've just hit enough problems with that just almost using GraphQL request as if it was fetch, right? Where I just make a call and I do what I want with the response, really explicitly, has been a really good balance for me.
Where do you store the data?
In Valtio. Yeah. Yeah. So how many of you are currently like actively looking through for your team or your project, like what should I use? I'm trying to figure out from like these 20,000 options what I should decide. Cool. And like how many of you, if you don't mind sharing, like what are you leaning towards? Are you kind of going through like, all right, I'm gonna spend a couple weeks and just try everything and see what feels right? Yeah, good?
I think we combination of like Redux or anything client side,
Mm-hmm.
state, we actually create the server.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're doing sort of a hybrid approach and like using different types of state management for different kinds of problems. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been mainly using Redux, but primarily for just the community support and like familiarity with it. And a lot of people that I know who work with Redux, it's not like a new library they have to learn.
Yep.
That's been the main reason, not necessarily for anything like it.
Gotcha. So you're mainly choosing Redux because it's been around forever. It'll probably be here when the Earth ends and the cockroaches die. It'll still be there, and you just want to use that. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
So for me, I'm generally using hooks in most stuff, because most code pages don't need a lot of state business logic, but for complex stuff, I'm experimenting with having a separate pure JavaScript kind of state management stuff, and then using some hooks and a pub sub thing to hook it back into my components. Because I might have like synchronous business logic, but then when I do a change, I will publish an event, and then the hook can re-render the component based on that. So just trying some stuff out, kind of have a local version of a store instead of a global Redux.
Yeah. That literally sounds like you're reinventing Valtio, though. So if you like that structure and that pattern, that may be a library to take a look at. Yeah. Yeah. Someone else? Or Recoil, actually. I mean, again, it's a bigger library backed by Facebook. Yeah, go ahead.
I currently use Redux because I love the serialization, the snapshots, and the time traveling. It keeps you from running into race conditions with APIs, it keeps it super simple to see your state. But I have worked in medium-sized apps that a lot of people have chucked everything into context. And it was a nightmare. And then they started using atomic state on top of that. So it was like context with like Reactable. And then I left the project, and now I think it's like context, Reactable, and Redux, and it just seems like a head case.
I'm curious how many of you, like the pain points you feel with state management, is it that you think the library or whatever your team chose is wrong, or it's just that no one implemented it consistently, like picked an approach and we all kind of did it in sort of a random hodgepodge of approaches. Who's actually had more of the problem of being inconsistently used, whatever approach you guys have tried? Okay, about like a third of you. Interesting, yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, I actually do personally wish, here's my final opinion, right? Like I wish that there was a better approach, kind of like a Vuex really, built into React, right? Like supported by the React team, designed to work as a first-class citizen, but it wasn't designed that you had to use it. And it's sort of, I think Views to me struck a really good balance here. If you're not familiar with Vuex, they looked at Redux and said, oh, let me put this inside a Vue, right? And made a version that's officially maintained and works really elegantly. But if you don't want to use it, there's no harm, right? Like you can just choose not to use it and use something else and just not import that. But I think there's a lot of reticence. I don't know, you have to look at the opinions of the people on the React core team, right? They haven't chose to do anything like that. I think their best approach was something like use reducer. That's like the sort of export or the standard hook. Because then you at least would have the standard approach, and if you have an opinion, you can choose to do whatever you want. But if you have an approach that everyone can kind of conglomerate on, and we don't have as many of the hodgepodge approaches by different teams erratically trying different things. Someone else had to raise their hand?
Is that kind of what Toolkit is now?
I think to an extent, yeah. You know, but that being said, I think like there's still people I've met who don't like Redux Toolkit, and they're like, I like Redux Duck, which is just a pattern, right? And they're still, in some ways, it's just if they would have said that, like, here's a really good default off-the-shelf solution. I think the funny thing about Redux Toolkit in my personal experience is that I've had a lot of pushback on a few teams where I was like, yeah, we probably, you know, like we all know Redux, and like I may have used Valti or whatever, but like let's all use Redux. And people had such bad experiences historically with Redux, they weren't even open to considering that Redux Toolkit was going to, you know, basically demolish the boilerplate down to like a third of what it used to be. So I would say that if you are choosing to use Redux and you want to go sort of greenfield on it and you don't have a lot of legacy, Redux Toolkit is to me fantastic, and it is by Redux themselves, and so they've done a really good job maintaining that. But it kind of goes along with the notion of like use Redux, and you have like you've got Redux Thunk and Redux Persist and Redux Toolkit. Like there's a whole bunch of things you put together that can help you out. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to say we use Redux Toolkit, and it includes Redux Thunk, by the way. So if you are using Redux, I think Redux Toolkit is the way to go, and it helps you modularize your code where you have those local features manage their own state and plugs it into the global store.
Yep. Yeah. The only other thing I didn't mention as a general concept that I would encourage you to consider, although every library handles this differently, right? Have you ever had a thing in any state management library? It's like, okay, I need to like, let's say example, it's an API call. I need to make sure I clear the error, set loading is true, set whatever, and then do the thing. And there's like 4 things that have to happen. And almost in Redux, most things, unless you do the Redux use batch, whatever, it makes 4 state changes, it re-renders 4 times, and you're like, well, I know these 4 things, but like I want them to go together, right? Now in the old days, when you would do set state, right, it would just merge the objects together and you would get 1 re-render. So Valtio and a few of the other atomic libraries, and Redux kind of has something like this. They do allow for that performance optimization where you have multiple state changes and you can batch them into 1. Some libraries haven't updated for that, some have, and I should maybe update this presentation which ones do and don't. Dramatic improvement in performance because you're just doing like dozens fewer re-renders, because it is pretty common to have to set 2 or 3 different pieces of state collectively. And you don't really intend to re-render between that, especially you'll get erratic bugs where it's like, an example might be, I clear the error and then I set loading true. Well, between those 2 things, I have another re-render where there was no error and there was no loading, right? So you get this like weird flicker of your UI elements. So that's another element that I think is a really important part of a good state management library. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, 15 does not manufacture.
So in terms of, but not if you do different use states. Like if you're using use state and you're doing separate things, then you will end up with different re-renders. And I think if you have like Redux, it will do a re-render. Unless I'm wrong about that. At least I remember it seeing re-renders by just synchronous updates in Redux. So I think if you're just using, I think for example, if you're doing like set state, probably if you're using class components, I think it does. But I will look into that again because maybe it's been fixed since I last remember. Cool, any other questions or thoughts? Awesome. Well, like every other speaker, I'm up here if you want to ask questions or yell at me and tell me that was the dumbest presentation you ever heard. Those are sometimes fun, actually. But outside of that, I do have one tactical question for you. Like, again, I'm pretty open as a presenter. Like, how would this presentation be better for you? Like, would it have been better to see code? Was it the right amount of information? Was it too basic? Was it too advanced? And again, I like criticism, so you're just doing me a favor if you tell me it sucked. Anyone? Or it's good. You can tell me that too.
It was really solid, like the way that you broke it down in a very consistent format and kind of like showed like these are the basic things about it, pros and cons, opinions. That was a really
Cool.
solid flow, very easy to follow.
Gotcha. And I do understand if you have something negative to say, thank you for the comment, that it's harder to do in an open thing. So just feel free, come yell at me after the fact. Yeah.
The previous comment I think was pretty cool. The speaker has coping examples going on, and then she also has a QR scanner.
Oh, that's a good
She'll
idea.
have a device camera of it. She'll have a QR scanner to give people time to actually get the code up. And
That's a good idea.
And then just go through the code that way. So.
That's a good idea. So like have the general stuff up on the screen, but if you do want to look at code, that's a really good, I actually really like that idea. Thank you. I'm going to use that. All right, I wouldn't hold everyone too long, but any other quick thoughts?
You could also put like that in a markdown or a blog post.
Yeah, and then let people link to it afterwards, or at least on like the last slide, put up a QR code. Here's all the code examples on like a gist or something like that. Yeah. 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 I like that. I do like. I really like the idea of like offloading the code to thing like you can actually look at in your computer, because I think it is harder on a screen. But I really like the sort of like building it, but letting it be sort of driven by you guys. Yeah. Yeah. All right, fantastic. I'm going to use that. Thank you, guys. Awesome. Well, again, if you have more thoughts, feel free to come up and ask me. Otherwise, I'll let you guys go. Thank you for attending, and hopefully it was a fun experience. Thank you.